Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to a new topic, political crisis in Nigeria, and I've divided this video lesson into two parts. In the first part, we're going to discuss a few of the political crises that happened in the early period of Nigeria's history. Please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the My School channel. Like I said earlier, we're moving on to political crisis in Nigeria, where we'll discuss some of those disruptions of usual political processes in the country. So let's dive right into it. So here are some of the things that we're going to discuss in these video lessons. We're going to begin with the definition of political crisis. We're also going to discuss the reasons for political crisis. Then we're going to look at some of the major political crises that have occurred in Nigeria over the years. So let's begin with the definition of political crisis. So a political crisis is a situation in which the normal political process of a country is disrupted, threatened, or brought to a standstill due to conflicts among political actors or groups. So in this definition of political crisis, there are very important keywords that should be used. So we are also going to talk about how normal political process is disrupted. So there is a usual way political activities take place in a particular country. When that usual method of political process is disrupted, then there is a political crisis. So when things are brought to a standstill as well, and when there is conflict among so many different groups within that society, there is usually a political crisis, especially when such conflict is politically motivated. So you're talking about political actors, people who have been put in a position to influence change in the country. When they decide to disrupt that normal political process, then there is a political crisis within that society. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so political crises arise when there is a breakdown in trust or legitimacy of governments or political institutions. So apart from the fact that political actors instigate political crisis, sometimes it can be from the citizens who discover that they've lost legitimacy. They've lost trust or legitimacy in the government, in the people in power. So political crisis often results in violence and instability. So when there is political crisis in a country, it can lead to riots, demonstrations, strikes, and so on and so forth. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, what are the reasons for political crisis? Why do political crises occur in a particular society? First of all, it can be as a result of ethnic or regional differences. So Nigeria is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to discuss the reasons for political crisis. Why is there political crisis in a particular society? One of the reasons is ethnic and regional differences. So Nigeria is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society. So political competition along ethnic or religious lines often fuels crisis. So when there is usually disputes among different ethnic groups within society or among different religions, it can lead to political crisis. Now let's move on to another reason. And that reason for political crisis is electoral malpractice. So this is very common in our Nigerian society. We see a lot of rigging, ballot stuffing, intimidation of voters, and biased electoral bodies. And all of this leads to loss of confidence in the democratic process. Whenever an election doesn't follow the interests of the people, sometimes the people can rise up to demonstrate against the government, and this can lead to political crisis. We're going to see a lot of that in some of the major political crises that have occurred over the years in Nigeria. Now let's discuss another reason for political crisis. And that reason is power also. Competition among political elites for leadership positions and access to state resources can also spark crisis. So this is when political actors actually start this political crisis in the society. So when political elites feel that they deserve a particular office or a particular position, they can incite violence within society, and this can lead to political crisis. Let's move on to another reason. And that reason for political crisis is weak political institutions. So when institutions like the judiciary, legislature, or electoral commission are not independent or strong, conflicts escalate instead of being resolved peacefully. So we understand that the judiciary, one of the main functions of the judiciary is to ensure that disputes among warring parties within society are resolved amicably. But when the judiciary is not independent, that means the legislature and the executive influences the activities of the judiciary. It can lead to conflicts not being resolved amicably. This can eventually escalate into a political crisis. Also, the Electoral Commission are meant to be independent. And when they are not independent, when they cannot perform their duties independently so that they can adequately represent the views, the interests of the people, it can also escalate into political conflicts. Now let's move on to another reason. Another reason for political crisis is corruption and bad governance. So mismanagement of resources and lack of accountability generates public anger, which also leads to uprisings or protests. So when the people feel like their needs are not being met and the people in power, instead of providing the necessary amenities to the citizens, they take advantage of that opportunity to divert funds to their personal accounts. This can lead to public anger. People can decide to rise up and protest against the leaders in power. So this can be another reason for political crisis. Now let's move on to another one. And that reason for political crisis is military intervention. So frequent coups weaken democratic processes and create crisis of legitimacy. We see that a lot in our Nigerian history. So from 1966 to 1999, we had a lot of military regimes. And so whenever these military leaders come into power, they usually incite violence within the society, especially with the way they handle the citizens. The citizens begin to feel like their rights and their privileges within the society are no longer respected by these leaders in power. So these leaders lack legitimacy, and this can incite crisis within the society. Let's move on to another reason for political crisis. So another reason is colonial legacy. So artificial borders, uneven development, and the divide and rule tactics left by colonial rule continue to fuel political instability. So all of these things have created a lot of differences among the people of Nigeria, and as a result of that, there are usually political crises that arise as a result of these things. So artificial borders has to do with the fact that the northern and southern Nigeria were brought together artificially, and some of the culture, the traditions of these people do not match, and sometimes this can lead to conflicts within the society. Uneven development, the divide and rule tactics, the fact that they decided to divide so many different regions within the country so that they can rule them separately, also fuel the disunity within the Nigerian society. The fact that so many of these regions no longer trust one another because they have not learned what it means to be in unity with one another. So all of these things fuels political crisis within the Nigerian society. So let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to discuss the major political crises in Nigeria. So political crises have shaped the history and development of Nigeria from the colonial period to the present day. And so these are some of the political crises that we've experienced. We have the Aba Women's Riot of 1929, the Kano Riot of 1953, the Census Crisis of 1962 and 63, the Action Group Crisis of 1962, the Federal Election Crisis of 1964, the Western Nigerian Election Crisis of 1965, the Nigerian Civil War, which took place between 1967 and 1970, the General Elections of 1979, the Kaduna Legislative/Executive Crisis of 1981, and the General Elections of 1983 and 1993. So let's begin with the Aba Women's Riot of 1929. So the Aba Women's Riot of 1929, also known as the Women's War, was a mass protest movement led by women in southeastern Nigeria during the colonial period. So it began in Oloko near Aba in November 1929 and quickly spread across the Owerri and Calabar provinces, and it involved more than 10,000 women at its peak. So women from 6 different ethnic groups, Igbo, Ibibio, Efik, Andoni, Ogoni, and Ijo, all participated in this riot. So it was organized and led mainly by rural women who were custodians of trade and local governance traditions disrupted by colonial rule. So the reason for this riot is the fact that the colonial masters were no longer respecting those traditions that have been put in place in these traditional societies before they came. So because of its scale, it is regarded as the first major revolt by women in West Africa against colonial rule. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss some of the causes of the riots. One of the causes of the riots is direct taxation. So in 1928, the British introduced direct taxation on men. And then in 1929, Assistant District Officer Captain J. Cook ordered an enumeration of households, livestock, and family members in Oloko. So women who were already burdened with supporting their families feared this was a prelude to taxation of women. So what happened in the society is that before this period, the men were normally taxed. They were the ones who were taxed by the colonial officers. When they now sent a district officer, an assistant district officer to their communities to count members of their households, their livestock, and their family members, they began to suspect that they are about to tax some of the women within the society. And so the spark now came when when Madame Nwayeruwa was asked to count her household and livestock. She angrily interpreted this as an attempt to tax women and mobilized others to resist. So this is how the riot started. Now let's move on to another cause. So another cause of the riot is the introduction of warrant chiefs. So the British system of warrant chiefs replaced traditional governance structures and excluded women's councils that had existed in pre-colonial society. So before the British people came, there were lots of women's councils who were there to represent the needs and the interests of the women within the society. But when the British people came, they imposed warrant chiefs on the people. Remember, we discussed this under the topic pre-colonial administration in Nigeria. We discussed how the Igbo society was an acephalous society. They had no centralized authority, and they ruled through direct democracy. So because of that, the British colonial masters knew that they needed someone who can implement the policies within their society. But discovering that the Igbo pre-colonial society did not have that centralized authority, they decided to impose these warrant chiefs on them. These warrant chiefs were designed to implement certain policies that have been introduced by the British colonial authorities. So the colonial authorities ignored women's institutions and created a patriarchal system. So this was one of the things that incited the riots within that society. So another cause of the riots is economic hardship. The Great Depression of 1929 reduced palm oil and kernel prices, hurting women traders. Women traders were especially involved in the trade of palm oil and palm kernels. They sold all of these things in their markets. Also, the fact that school fees, forced labors, and market tolls added to their struggles. So at that period, the Great Depression occurred after the First World War. So it was not only affecting the European countries who were involved in the war, it also affected those people that were being colonized by the European societies. And so there was a lot of economic hardship within the African society. And so all of these things were taking a toll on the women. And the fact that they were now about to bring in this taxation into their society incited within the society to riot against the British colonial system. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to discuss the events of the riot, what actually occurred during this period. So the local incident which took place in November 1929 is Madame Nwayeruwa's confrontation with Mark Emeruewa, which led to a mass gathering of women. So Mark Emeruewa was a warrant chief during that period. So when she confronted them, the confrontation did not yield any result, and as a result of that, the women in society decided to gather en masse to protest against the taxation that was about to be imposed upon them. So they sent palm fronds, which is a traditional signal, to mobilize others across districts. And then the protest leaders, known as the local trio, Ikonia, Unwanedia, and Unwogo, coordinated the demonstrations. So women used traditional method of sitting on a man, singing, dancing, mocking, and shaming corrupt officials by following them everywhere until they resigned. So that is the tradition of sitting on the man. They sit in front of their office, they continue singing and dancing and mocking these warrant chiefs as they come and go doing their daily business. So this was their tactic of protest. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, the protest escalated into attacks on colonial structures. So 16 native courts were destroyed, European factories were looted, prisons were raided, and prisoners freed. So despite women's attempts to keep the movement peaceful, colonial police and troops violently suppressed the protests. So by January 1930, about 55 women were killed and many more were injured. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so what are the political implications of these riots? First of all, there were colonial reforms. So the British abolished the system of warrant chiefs in 1930 and later included women in the native courts. There was the boost of African nationalism. Although local in origin, the revolt is regarded as a prelude to Nigerian and African nationalist movements. So it demonstrated that colonial policies could be successfully resisted. There was also the recognition of the role of women. So women reclaimed their place in governance and society. Figures like Madame Nwayeruwa and Madame Mary Okezie became symbols of women's political empowerment. So we've come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. I believe it was educative and enlightening. If you would like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There you can continue this journey with us. So we're going to move on to the Kano Riot of 1953, and then we're also going to discuss several other riots that took place during that period. So I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.